Would you risk your life for someone who never even looked at you like a human? 12-year-old Malik lived in a small, run-down apartment with his grandmother, Miss Etta. The walls were cracked, the floor creaked with every step, and the neighborhood outside their window was a place most people avoided. But inside that tiny space, there was warmth, love, and the steady wisdom of the woman who had raised him. Miss Etta had taken Malik in when he was just a baby, after his parents passed away. She had done her best on a tiny pension, stretching every dollar, making sure he never went hungry, and giving him all the love she could. The world outside didn't care about them. People walked past them as if they didn't exist. But to Malik, Miss Etta was the whole world. Their neighborhood wasn't safe. Gunshots echoed at night, and sirens were as common as the wind. But Miss Etta never let fear rule their home. She always said, "Baby, no matter how they see you, you know your worth." Money was always tight, and Malik did what he could to help. He ran errands for neighbors, fixed broken things, and even swept up at the corner store for a few dollars. He never complained. Miss Etta had sacrificed for him, and he wanted to do the same for her. One evening, Malik sat at their tiny kitchen table, watching Miss Etta count her last few bills. Her hands trembled slightly as she set them down, rubbing her forehead. "We'll be all right," she said, forcing a smile. "We always are." Malik nodded, but inside he wished he could do more. He hated seeing her worry. He hated that the world didn't seem to care. The next day, on his way back from the store, he saw a group of kids huddled together near the alley. Their faces were tense, their voices hushed. He knew better than to get involved, but something about the way they kept glancing over their shoulders made him pause. Then he heard it, a deep, low voice. This is it, no mistakes. Malik's heart pounded. He knew trouble when he saw it. And this was worse than anything he had ever stumbled upon. He ducked behind a dumpster, listening. The group was talking about a job, something risky, something that involved weapons. He held his breath, trying to process what he had just overheard. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to go home, to forget what he had heard. But Miss Etta's voice echoed in his head. "Baby, no matter how they see you, you know your worth." And in that moment, he realized he was the only one who could stop whatever was about to happen. He ran home, bursting through the door. "Miss Etta, I need to tell you something," he said, panting. She frowned, setting down her teacup. "What is it, baby?" "I think some guys are about to do something bad, real bad." She studied his face, sensing his fear. "Tell me everything." As he spoke, her expression turned grim. When he finished, she took a deep breath and reached for the phone. "We have to call someone." Malik grabbed her hand. "What if they find out it was me?" Miss Etta looked at him, her eyes full of wisdom. "Doing the right thing is never easy, baby, but it's still right." He nodded slowly, his chest tight. He wasn't just a kid trying to survive anymore. He was about to make a choice that could change everything. The boy they ignored was about to become the only one who could save them all. "Where are you watching from? And what time is it?" Malik wasn't part of the protest. He was there to buy bread for Miss Etta when he got caught in the crowd. The streets were filled with thousands of angry protesters, shouting, waving signs, and marching forward. The air was thick with chants and frustration. Some people held their signs high, demanding justice, while others pushed forward, their emotions spilling over. The city, usually filled with honking cars and busy commuters, had transformed into a scene of unrest. Police barricades lined the streets. Officers in riot gear stood ready, tension rising by the second. Their faces were hidden behind shields, their hands gripping batons tightly. Malik wasn't sure what had sparked the protest, but he could feel the weight of anger pressing against him. He had to find a way out before things got worse. Then he saw her, Madeline Carter, a well-known 35-year-old journalist, reporting live for a major news network. She stood on the sidewalk, a camera crew just a few steps away, speaking into a microphone with practiced ease. Even in the chaos, she looked composed, her tailored suit crisp, her voice steady. She had been in the news for years, covering the city's struggles, always appearing confident and untouchable on TV. Malik had seen her before, always talking about the city's problems, but never in the middle of them. She was different from the people protesting. She was an outsider looking in. But today, she was in the middle of something she didn't understand. The energy of the protest shifted. It was subtle at first, a few shouts turning sharper, bodies pressing closer together. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Some people weren't just there to protest anymore. The frustration had reached a boiling point, and Malik could feel the explosion coming. The crowd was turning, and she didn't even notice. A bottle flew through the air, smashing onto the pavement near the police line. That was all it took. Officers tensed, their grips tightening. Protesters surged forward, voices rising to a fever pitch. Signs waved frantically. A wave of panic rippled through the mass of bodies, pushing against one another, confusion and anger mixing in the air. Madeline kept speaking, her focus still on the camera. She didn't see the change happening around her. The security of distance that television had always given her was gone. She was in it now, and she had no idea. Malik's heart pounded. He had to move. He had to get away. But something held him there. He had been ignored his whole life. Just another kid from a poor neighborhood. But Miss Etta had always told him, "Baby, no matter how they see you, you know your worth." And right now, his worth was knowing what was about to happen. He looked back at Madeline Carter. People were pushing closer to her. Someone was shouting at her now, their voice angry, their face red with rage. She took a step back, glancing around, confusion flickering across her face for the first time. She wasn't safe, and she didn't even know it. Malik took a deep breath. He didn't know her. She didn't know him. But that didn't matter. He stepped forward. A group within the protest grew more aggressive, pushing past barricades. What had started as a chant for justice now carried a darker edge. The shouts grew louder, fists clenched tighter, and the energy in the crowd turned volatile. People were shouting, throwing objects, and tensions erupted into chaos. A metal trash can was kicked over, its contents spilling onto the street. Someone hurled a plastic bottle, then another. The police line held firm, but the officers tensed, their grips tightening on their shields. The protesters' anger had been simmering, and now it boiled over. Malik noticed the shift first, angry eyes turning toward the journalist. His stomach twisted. He had seen how quickly things could spiral, how fast a peaceful moment could become something dangerous. He knew the warning signs, the way the air felt just before everything exploded. "She's twisting the story," someone yelled. "She works for the system," another voice accused. Madeline Carter stood in the same spot, unaware of the hostility brewing around her. She kept reporting, speaking into the microphone with the same composed tone she had used at the start. The camera crew focused on her, oblivious to the growing danger just beyond their lenses. Suddenly, the peaceful protest became a mob, and Madeline was in the center of it. The shift was almost instant. One moment, she was a distant observer, and the next, she was the target. The shouts became jeers. The signs, once held high with purpose, were now being used as weapons. People shoved forward, closing in. The air filled with an ugly kind of rage, the kind that spread like wildfire. Malik knew what came next. He had seen it before. "You need to move," Malik shouted. But she didn't hear him. The noise swallowed his voice. He tried again, but she was too focused on her report, too caught up in the story to realize she had become part of it. A man near the front stepped forward, pointing directly at her. Others followed his gaze. Madeline glanced up, finally sensing the change, her expression flickering with confusion. It was too late. The crowd surged toward her. Malik's instincts screamed at him to run, to get out of there before things got worse. But he couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the pavement. He had seen anger before, seen fear, but this was different. This was something else entirely. The camera crew backed away. One of the crew members grabbed Madeline's arm, urging her to move, but she hesitated. Maybe she still believed she could control the situation. Maybe she didn't want to be seen running away on live television. But Malik knew better. The first shove sent her stumbling. Someone yanked at her sleeve. Another protester snatched the microphone from her hand and threw it to the ground. The camera toppled over, the screen shattering upon impact. The protest had officially lost its purpose. It was no longer about justice. It was about rage. "Move!" Malik tried again, this time pushing toward her. But the bodies pressing in around him made it nearly impossible to get through. Madeline was trying to push back, her voice lost in the uproar. More hands grabbed at her, shoving, pulling. Panic flared in her eyes. She wasn't reporting anymore. She was just trying to survive. The police moved in, shields up, batons raised. Tear gas canisters were fired into the air. The thick smoke rolled through the streets, stinging Malik's eyes. People coughed, screamed, scattered in every direction. But the damage had already been done. Through the haze, Malik caught one last glimpse of Madeline, lost in the chaos. He had to do something. The boy they ignored was the only one paying attention. "What book are you reading?" Malik darted through the crowd, weaving past protesters, his small frame making him nearly invisible. The mob was spiraling out of control. Shouts erupted all around him, fists swung wildly, and the air was thick with tension. He had no time to think, only time to act. Madeline stood frozen in the chaos, unaware of the danger closing in. Malik saw it before she did. A glass bottle arced through the air, spinning toward her. His instincts took over. He grabbed Madeline's arm, yanking her back just as the bottle smashed against the pavement where she had stood. Shards of glass scattered across the ground. She gasped, startled, turning to face him. "Come on," he urged, pulling her toward an alleyway. She resisted at first. Who was this kid grabbing her? Her eyes darted between Malik and the angry crowd. Confusion clouded her expression, but then she saw the fury in the people surrounding her. She had no choice. They ran. Malik led her through back streets, past dumpsters and fire escapes, his feet pounding against the pavement. He knew these streets, knew the shortcuts, the hidden alleys, the places where no one would look. Madeline stumbled behind him, struggling to keep up in her heeled shoes. Shouts echoed behind them. Footsteps followed. The mob wasn't just angry. It was hunting. A metal trash can crashed over as someone pushed past it. Malik's breath came in short gasps. They had to keep moving. He took a sharp left into a narrow alley. It smelled of damp concrete and garbage, but it was a path to safety. He pressed his back against the cold brick wall, pulling Madeline down with him. He placed a finger to his lips, urging silence. Heavy footsteps thundered past the alley entrance. Shouts rang out, growing fainter as the mob spread in different directions. Malik barely breathed. Minutes passed. Finally, Madeline exhaled, her whole body trembling. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Malik," he said simply. She studied him, her mind racing. This kid had just saved her, and yet nobody would believe it. Malik peeked out from the alley, checking both ends of the street. The mob had moved further down, but they weren't gone. The chaos still raged in the distance, sirens blaring, the sound of smashing glass echoing through the city. They had only a small window to escape. "We have to keep going," Malik said, stepping forward. Madeline hesitated. Her knees were shaking. She had spent years reporting on city violence, but now she was living it. This wasn't a story she could walk away from. "Move!" Malik said again, more urgently. She nodded and followed. He led her through a series of alleys, zigzagging between buildings, past old, rusted fire escapes and abandoned storefronts. Every step took them further from danger. But Malik didn't stop until they reached an old service entrance at the back of a warehouse. He pulled on the door handle. Locked. Frustrated, he looked around, spotting a stack of wooden pallets leading up to a second-floor window. He gestured toward it. "We can climb up." Madeline hesitated again. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Malik didn't answer. He just started climbing. Madeline swallowed hard, then followed. It wasn't graceful, but she made it to the top. Malik helped her through the window, and they dropped inside. The warehouse was dark and silent. Malik pressed his ear to the door. The shouts outside had faded. For now, they were safe. But they both knew the night wasn't over yet. They stopped in a dark alley, both breathless, their hearts pounding. The distant roar of the mob still echoed through the streets, but for now, they were hidden, shielded by the shadows. Malik leaned against the rough brick wall, inhaling deeply, trying to slow his racing heart. Madeline turned to Malik, finally taking a good look at him. Her hands were still trembling, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She had spent her career reporting on danger, but tonight, she had been the story. And this boy, this stranger, had been the one to pull her out of it. Her breath was still uneven as she wiped sweat from her brow. The adrenaline was wearing off, but her mind raced with unanswered questions. Everything she thought she knew about situations like this told her not to trust kids like him. She had covered stories about gangs, crime, and violence. Kids from neighborhoods like his weren't supposed to be the heroes, but Malik had risked everything to save her. Why would he do that? She studied him closely. His clothes were worn, his sneakers scuffed, but his eyes held something she didn't expect: determination, resilience, and something else: honesty. Malik shifted under her gaze. He was used to people looking at him with suspicion. He had spent his whole life being judged before he even spoke a word. But this moment felt different. She let out a slow breath, glancing back toward the alley's entrance. The city was still in chaos. Sirens wailed in the distance. They weren't safe yet, but she wasn't running anymore. Not from the mob. Not from the truth. He turned toward the entrance of the alley, checking to see if the street was clear. They couldn't stay here long. He knew that. She knew that. But for some reason, she wasn't moving. Maybe she was still processing. Maybe she was waiting for something. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Madeline crossed her arms and sighed. "I don't get it. Why help me?" Malik shrugged. I saw what was coming. You didn't." She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. She had spent years reporting on people like him without really seeing them, without really knowing what they faced. And yet, this kid had just pulled her out of a riot without hesitation. Her eyes drifted toward the street. The sounds of the city raged on, sirens, shouts, the distant roar of a crowd still unsettled. She had always believed she understood the pulse of this place, the rhythm of its people. But now she realized how little she actually knew. Malik exhaled, rolling his shoulders, trying to shake off the tension. He had done what he needed to do. He wasn't expecting gratitude. He wasn't expecting anything at all. But still, he waited. Madeline glanced at him again, but this time she didn't just see a kid from the wrong side of the city. She didn't see the stereotypes she had once reported on. For the first time she saw him, not as a poor black boy, but as a person. Madeline sat on the cold pavement, her breath still uneven, as she processed everything that had just happened. The world outside the alley still roared with chaos, but here, in this moment, there was quiet. Her hands trembled as she brushed back strands of hair from her face. Her heart pounded, but not from fear anymore. This was something else. She looked at Malik, really looked at him, not just as the kid who had pulled her out of danger, not just as someone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, but as something more. "Why did you help me?" she asked, still catching her breath. "Because no one else would," Malik answered. His voice was steady, matter of fact. There was no hesitation, no self-pity, just truth. He wasn't looking for thanks, wasn't expecting recognition. He had simply done what he thought was right. The weight of his words settled heavily in her chest. She had spent years reporting on the struggles of this city, on people who felt unheard and unseen. But had she ever truly understood them? She looked him over again. His clothes were worn, but clean, his sneakers scuffed from miles of walking. He wasn't just some street kid, some nameless figure in a statistic. He was real. He had saved her, risked his own safety to make sure she got out alive. "Where do you live?" she asked. "With my grandma, Miss Etta," he said proudly. There was a flicker of warmth in his voice when he said her name, a small smile that came and went in an instant. The words hit Madeline harder than she expected. She had assumed. What had she assumed? That he was alone, that he had no one. But he did. He had a home, a family. And yet he had still chosen to risk everything for a stranger. She exhaled, running a hand over her face. Her whole career had been built on exposing truth, showing the world what it needed to see. And now, here was a truth she hadn't been ready for. And that's when Madeline did something nobody expected. Days later, Madeline stood outside a small apartment in a struggling neighborhood. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the worn brick buildings. This place was different from the glass towers and pristine streets she was used to. Here, life moved slower, heavier. She took a breath and knocked on the door. It opened a moment later, and Miss Etta stood there, surprised to see the famous journalist standing on her doorstep. Her warm brown eyes studied Madeline carefully, taking in the expensive coat, the uncertainty in her expression. "I wanted to thank you," Madeline said, her gaze shifting to Malik, who appeared behind his grandmother. "He saved my life." Miss Etta smiled, placing a proud hand on Malik's shoulder. "That's just the kind of boy he is." Malik said nothing, his hands tucked into his pockets. He had never expected to see her again. People like her didn't come to neighborhoods like this unless they had a story to tell. But she wasn't holding a microphone this time. She wasn't reporting. She was here for something else. Madeline hesitated before speaking again. I know that a thank you isn't enough. Miss Etta's smile faded slightly, but she nodded, waiting for her to continue. I wanted to help, Madeline said carefully. I have connections, resources that could make things easier for you. Miss Etta tilted her head. We don't take handouts. I'm not offering one. Madeline took a breath. I can help get you better health care, make sure you have access to what you need. And Malik, there are programs that could open doors for him. I know some people who could get him into a mentorship program, a good one. Miss Etta looked down at Malik. He was staring at the floor, unreadable. She knew the weight of the world sat heavy on his young shoulders. He had always done whatever he could to help, to make things easier on her. Maybe it was time someone made things easier for him. You don't owe us anything, Miss Etta finally said. Madeline shook her head. You're wrong about that. She met Malik's eyes. You gave me a second chance. It's only fair I give you one, too. Silence filled the space between them. Malik shifted slightly, stealing a glance at his grandmother. He had never wanted pity. He had never asked for favors. But this wasn't charity. It was something else. A chance. Miss Etta finally nodded, her fingers squeezing Malik's shoulder. All right, she said softly. We'll listen. Madeline smiled, relief washing over her. She'd come here to say thank you, but she had left with something more. Malik had saved her that day. But in the end, she helped change his life, too.